For today's lesson, we are going to review some of the most basic rhetorical devices you may need to call on in assessments and moving forward. Although there are a plethora of rhetorical devices in use, we're going to focus on a few of the most common elements so that you can become a master of them. Specifically, the objective for today's lesson is that through the study of basic rhetorical devices, you will be able to identify the term in a given text. And ultimately, our goal is to be able to analyze why is this term used, and then how does it affect the audience. In other words, I want you to think, I know what blank means, and then I want you to think, I know when blank happens in a text. Very basic level, we just want to be able to identify these devices as they occur. So, what are rhetorical devices? Rhetorical devices are the tools of language that make communication particularly effective. These might be patterns of words and ideas that create emphasis, clarify meaning, or stir emotions. It is the intentional use of language to have a specific effect on the audience. I like to think of rhetorical devices as the little tricks of the trade of advertising, the ways in which people get in your heads and make you do things their way. For the purposes of this course, we've divided these devices into a couple of specific groups. We've looked at figurative language, we've looked at diction and syntax, and we've looked at argumentation and rhetoric. And now we're putting all of these together to be able to analyze them in literature. By focusing on a few of the common devices, you're going to be able to master rhetorical analysis quicker and more effectively. So these are some of the top rhetorical devices and the ones that I would really like for you to become an expert on. First, you see repetition and restatement. Those are very common. You think you know what they are, and there is a little bit of confusion, so we're going to clear that up today. Next is Anaphora and Epiphora. These two are intentionally placed together so that we can look at what they are and see how we can remember which one is which. Next, we're going to look at rhetorical question and hypophora. My guess is you've probably been taught rhetorical question in the past, but your teacher may not have talked about the difference between hypophora. So we're going to look at that today. Next, we're going to look at antithesis. I know that we've discussed this before, but it seems like there's a little bit of confusion. Aside from that, we're going to bring in paradox and oxymoron because that's something that I see frequently confused, and I've lumped them together so we can see how they're alike and how they're different, and hopefully be able to tell them apart as well. Next, we're going to look at exclamation and invective. Both of these are obviously involving things that are exclaimed or things that have some type of emotion behind them. But what exactly is an invective, and how is it different from an exclamation? We're going to look at that too. Next, we're going to review parallelism, concession, and then we're going to move on to two that might be kind of new for you. I've put these two together because they're also very alike. We're looking at Asyndeton and Polysyndeton. Finally, we're going to look at tropes. Now, you should remember what those are because we've really talked about them a great deal so far. But just in case, I've included them as a gentle reminder. So I want to kind of start with the easy one, repetition and restatement. When you look at these two, what you'll notice is that repetition is an exact duplication of what was previously said, while restatement is repeating the ideas but using different words. So very similar, but just different enough to really have to think about it. So I have some examples here. Both of these are going to come from Patrick Henry's famous speech. The first one you'll see is, "We must fight." I repeat it, sir, we must fight. Now, as you look at that, you can see the exact replication. You have "we must fight," repeated again with "we must fight." Henry's really nice. He actually told us that he was going to repeat it too, so we know to look for it. So obviously, this is repetition because it's an exact duplication of what was previously stated. In the next example, you see The war is actually begun. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? When we look at this and we see what the ideas are that he's talking about, the war is already begun. So here he has told us this is already happening. But he goes on in the next line to say, our brethren are already in the field. Well, if they're already in the field, that's just another way of saying the war is actually begun. So he is saying the same thing, but he's using different words. By using different words, he's emphasizing it and getting into our heads. Next is Anaphora and Epiphora. As we look at these two, I want to just kind of point out the difference here. First, with Anaphora, it's repetition at the beginning. So I think of it because A is the beginning letter of the alphabet. And Epiphora is at the ends. So really, if you can remember what Anaphora is and remember A is the beginning, then you know the other one is the opposite. And for me, that's the trick that works. I do have a couple of examples here, so let's see if we can figure them out. First, from Charles Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Obviously, you hear that repetition, so we can say that this is a type of repetition. When we're looking at it and we're looking to see, okay, is it at the beginning or at the end of the lines? This one could be tricky because it was the best of times and it was the worst. The only difference here really is best and worst. Looking at another example, the Apostle Paul said, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. When we look at this one, we're looking at where that repetition occurs. As a child is the repetition that we see. Okay, so when we're looking at questioning, you know this. A rhetorical question is when the speaker asks a question and the answer is already known. But what some people seem to misunderstand is that when asking a rhetorical question, the answer is not given during the speech. That's a very different element. That's an element called Epiphora. Epiphora occurs when the speaker asks a question and then continues to answer the question for the audience. So the difference here is with a rhetorical question, there's no answer. It's already known, it may be implied, but it's in your head and I don't have to say it. But with Epiphora, I have to say that answer because I want to make sure that you're on the right page with me. I'm really bringing in that emphasis. And although these are commonly taught as the same device, they're actually very different devices. So let's look at an example. Here we have from Dwight Eisenhower. When the enemy struck on that June day of 1950, what did America do? It did what it has always done in its time of peril. It appeals to the heroism of its youth. So not only have we asked that question to sort of channel your thinking, we've answered it for you. In case you were trying to figure out, wait a minute, what are we talking about? What happened in June 1950? Why does that sound familiar? We're not going to see to it that you're confused about that. Instead, I'm just going to give you the exact answer. Here's what it is. It did what it's always done. It went straight to the heroism of youth. Next is antithesis, not antithesis. Antithesis. This is a figure of balance in which contrasting ideas are intentionally juxtaposed. So when we think about how they're sort of put together when it seems like they wouldn't be, let's look at an example. Lincoln says, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." One thing I really kind of want to point out is you have that those contrasting ideas. The world is not going to note this. They're not going to long remember it, but they'll never forget what they did. I also want to point out that this is sort of parallel as you think through it. Let's look at another example. Nixon said, "We are caught in war, wanting peace. We are torn by division, wanting unity." Again, as you look at this, you see the idea of war with peace and the idea of division with unity. Again, you still see that parallelism with the antithesis. So next, let's see. What is this commonly confused with, you ask? I've got that answer for you coming up next. Okay, paradox versus an oxymoron. A paradox, we know, is a statement of contradiction. It seems nonsensical, but it evokes some measure of the truth. Well, that's sort of what oxymoron is, but here's the difference, and it's actually kind of obvious now that we think about it like this. An oxymoron is two words that are ordinarily contradictory, but they've been placed by side. So in other words, you could think of an oxymoron as a two-word paradox. So in class, we've talked about the example of jumbo shrimp or Biggie Smalls, but I don't think that we've explicitly looked at these two terms side by side. So let's look at some examples. Here we have Hubert Humphrey. He says, he's speaking of Martin Luther King here, the assassination. He says, "The criminal act that took his life brings shame to our country. An apostle of nonviolence has been the victim of violence." So think about this. Do we have two words that are placed side by side? Or are these ideas that are sort of separated in the sentence? Right. You have that separation. The idea of him as an apostle of nonviolence being the victim of violence. It's the opposite of what you would expect, yet it's exactly what happened to him. So let's look at the next example. Here we have Robert Griffin. Now, in this example, he is speaking about when he won the Heisman Trophy. And he said, "It's unbelievably believable." You know, it's unbelievable because in the moment, we're all amazed when great things happen. But unbelievable because, great things don't happen without hard work. This is an oxymoron because when you look at it and you see what are these two things that are placed together, here we have unbelievably believable side by side. Two-word paradox, and he does go in and give us a little bit of an explanation, thankfully, but most of the time in literature, we're not going to have that continued explanation. We just have these two terms that don't seem like they go together, but they're smushed together side by side, and somehow it works. Next, we're looking at the differences between exclamation and invective. I think when we see these terms side by side, it becomes a little bit easier for us to understand them. An exclamation is a statement of strong feeling. It's usually accompanied by an exclamation mark. When we're looking at invective, invective is usually abusive and negative language that attacks, insults, or denounces a person, a topic, or an institution. So you sort of see that while exclamation has strong feelings, invective is almost an attack. It's directed towards something specific, and generally, it's a very negative thing. Let's look at some examples. So again, from Patrick Henry's speech, he says, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Now, we have a whole host of things happening here, but when we look at this, we see strong emotion. He does not want to be feeling like he is enslaved. He does not want this absence of freedom anymore. So we have that strong emotion, and we have that lovely exclamation mark that signifies it for us. When we look at the next example, we see Jonathan Swift saying, "I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth." The thing that makes this one a little different is, obviously, we're not going to see that exclamation point. Sometimes it's there, but not normally. However, what we do see is that we're talking about the natives, and we are absolutely insulting them as a whole. We are saying that they are the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that ever were suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. So obviously very negative and directed specifically towards something. So what we see is that idea of exclamation in the first example, the strong emotion, while we have that second example of invective where we're talking directly toward and insulting a specific group. We've looked at parallelism several times, and I know that you're pretty good at recognizing it, but I wanted to include it here just so that we've got that reminder. Parallelism is the framing of the words, the sentences, or the paragraphs to give structural similarity. And when we've talked about this before, we have talked about how they have that same structure, that same grammatical structure in the context of the sentence. We just talked about it with antithesis, and so now we're going to look at an example here. Neil Armstrong says, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." When we're looking at it, we can see that very same structure. One small step, one giant leap for man, for mankind. So when we put it together, we have that repetition of that structure in the statement. So let's look at another example. This is from Dickens. There's no way I could talk about parallelism without bringing him in. He says it was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. Now, if you've been paying attention, you're looking at this one and you're thinking, that's very similar to some of the other devices that we've talked about today. And you want to go back and you think, it was the age of, it was the age of. So, pop quiz, what was that device? I'm not going to tell you. I want you to go back and see. Make sure you've mastered it. That repetition at the beginning. But here we're using it as an example in parallelism. The structural similarity between the first part and the second part, it is the same. Next, we're looking at concession. We talked about concessions and conceding when we talked about argumentation, but I want you to think about this as a rhetorical device as well, because in concession, you are acknowledging the opponent's argument to show understanding and consideration of the issue from all sides. So this can sort of make it seem like, I've thought about it all the way around, and this is the only option we have. It sort of makes it seem like you're a more mature person of reason because you've thought about it at all these different angles. So let's look at an example. George Orwell says, I said that the decadence of our language is probably curable. Those who deny this would argue, if they produced an argument at all, that language merely reflects existing social condition. So by saying, this is what I've said, here's what other people might argue, he's now able to shut that argument down and more effectively communicate with his audience what his purpose is, so they might believe what he's saying. Okay, the next two are new. Asyndeton and Polysyndeton. This is about the conjunction structure in the way that it's written. Asyndeton is normal conjunctions are intentionally omitted from a string of words. So we're going to look at that here in just a second. The other one that I want you to know is Polysyndeton, and this is sort of the opposite because Polysyndeton is the deliberate and excessive use of conjunctions. So in Asyndeton, you have the absence, and I want you to remember this, okay? So if it is intentionally omitted, it is absent. Asyndeton is A for absent. When you're looking at Polysyndeton, this is the excessive use. If it is excessive, there are many, and you know poly means many. So that's how we're going to remember what these two are. Now we're going to look at these examples, and we're going to try to decide, is it Asyndeton or is it Polysyndeton? And I think you're going to be able to easily figure it out because we're looking at them side by side. All right, the first example, Lewis, thank you. He comes, he sleeps, he goes. So the plot thickens. Okay, so if we look at Asyndeton, we've got A meaning absent. So conjunctions are absent. Polysyndeton are many conjunctions. When I look at this and I look through the sentence and I see the part that seems to have some repetition is right here. He comes, he sleeps, he goes. And the one thing I notice when I look at it is there is an absence of conjunctions that would have logical flow here. So I think this one must be Asyndeton because the conjunctions that should be there are omitted. The absence of conjunctions is Asyndeton. So let's look at another example. This is from Genesis. When we look at it, it says, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. The first thing that stands out in my mind as I hear this is that word and was in there so many times that it really stood out to me. If I look at this and I think, is this Asyndeton or Polysyndeton? I'm thinking there were many ands. There was an excessive amount of conjunctions. And because that was excessive, it is many, and many means poly, so Polysyndeton is in this example. Again, as you look at this, Asyndeton is the absence, A for absence. Polysyndeton is excessive. Poly is many. finally, we have tropes. The tropes that we think of are basically just figures of speech in which the words carry a meaning other than their literal sense. And we've talked about this in the past, but may not have used the word trope. So what exactly is it? Well, these are all of the figures of speech, the figurative language that you know and love. So this would include simile, metaphor, personification, synecdoche, puns, apostrophe, onomatopoeia, hyperbole. You get the idea. But these are just a few of the most common. So, 16 words. Think you've got it? So our objective for today was that through the study of basic rhetorical devices, you'd be able to identify the term in a given text. Well, now it's time to take it to the next level. What you're going to do is revisit your homework. You are expected to find 3 examples of rhetorical devices in the text. I want you to go back and ensure that you have identified these devices correctly. That's your first step. But that's not all you're going to do. You're going to add to it. How, you ask? In order to add to it, you're going to look over all of the 16 terms that we reviewed today. You should have started with 3 rhetorical devices, but now you're going to increase to 8. Again, there can be no repetition, so you can only use each device one time. The question then becomes, what is my final product supposed to look like? So you're going to create what's called a double entry journal. Basically, you're going to fold your page in half, and you're going to have 2 areas on the page. On the left-hand side, you want to identify the rhetorical device and give the definition. On the right-hand side, you're going to give the text example and how you know it is this device. So, if you're wanting to get full credit for this assignment, you're going to have all parts of the assignment. You must have the rhetorical device, and you must include the definition. This is sort of like a check and balance to make sure that it is what you say it is. Then I want you to give the text example and how you know it's this device. It's important that you explain how you know that this is what it is, because some devices can be other things, and I want to make sure that you truly understand what you're looking at with each device. Think an example would be beneficial? I've got you covered. In class, we talked about rhetorical devices. So you'll see that I have diction. Diction is the use of specific words and phrases to create tone and build a specific effect. So I have given the 2 elements that I'm supposed to have here. First, I need to give the rhetorical device. I've included the device. Next, I need to give the definition. Here is the definition. Now, with this particular side, I didn't bother with making sure that I had complete sentences or anything like that, because again, this is just a check and a balance to make sure that I know what the device is and I'm able to label it appropriately. The next piece is where I really want you to put most of your energy. This looks long, doesn't it? That's kind of what I expect from you in this class. I want you to give a strong, thorough answer in complete sentences. So let's look at this. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation. I want to point out, first of all, that I'm supposed to have the text example. This right here is from the text. So then I go on to explain how I know it is this device. This is an example of diction because he intentionally picked words with strong, harsh, connotative meanings. This would have affected the audience by highlighting the injustices of Britain and encouraging the need for separation. So, with this, I want you to make sure that you have all of the elements in order to get all of your credit. So, in all, you should have a total of 8 rhetorical devices. There can be no repeats, so there must be 8 different devices that you find in different places in the text. Remember, some examples might be more than one type of rhetoric, and that's okay. That's why you have to explain how you know it is this device. We've gone through a lot today, but I feel like you're going to have a better understanding of what these devices are, and therefore be able to better find them in the text. You are now free to work at your own pace and to come up with 8 separate rhetorical devices that are present in the text. Don't forget to tell what is the device and give the definition of the device. Give the text example and how you know it is this device. Good luck. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.